Okay, respiration without oxygen. We're going to just call it fermentation. Be happy with that. Glycolysis takes place. That's always the first step. No matter what, glycolysis takes place. And then at the end of glycolysis, you get pyruvate. And then pyruvate has two pathways it can choose, either into lactate or into alcohol. So you have a lactic acid fermentation, or you'll have a alcoholic decarboxylation type deal. So when you're undergoing glycolysis and when you're taking the glucose and you're splitting it, you are breaking bonds. That releases electrons. And so this NADH picks up these electrons along with a hydrogen, a couple of them really, and then it has to do something with it. This electron is energy, and so it has to put it someplace. It can either take it to the electron transport chain, or it can drop it off on another molecule, another organic molecule, and pyruvate is there, and that's what it will do. And so by dropping off the electrons back on the pyruvate, it frees up the NAD to go back and to allow glycolysis to continue. No NAD, no glycolysis, no glycolysis, no ATP, no life. So it's very important. So NAD picks up the electrons and a hydrogen or a proton and is converted into NADH. At the end of glycolysis, the NADH has to drop its electrons off. If it can't go to the electron transport chain because oxygen is not present, it drops it off on an organic electron acceptor, and that's pyruvate. So when this happens, when this fermentation happens and such, depending upon if it happens within your muscles or when it happens with certain bacteria, when it happens in certain fungus, you get different products. So with certain bacteria, we can produce lactic acid, just like in your muscles. That lactic acid alters the pH of the milk, and then it'll actually cause the proteins in the milk to change their shape, curdle, and you get cheese curds. Industrially, we can do this with certain bacteria, and we can get a whole different host of types of organic acids that we use in our daily lives. When we use certain yeast, the Saccharomyces yeast and such, when we do it in flour and we give them the right sugars and water and such to the right amount, they will then undergo this fermentation process, and they'll do an alcoholic fermentation where instead of being 3 carbons, one of the carbons is broken down and turned into CO2, and that carbon dioxide then gets trapped in the flour that's been produced, the dough that's been produced, and it will cause these air pockets to show up. And that's how bread rises. You'll see that in certain cheeses, like Swiss cheeses that have large holes in it, from the same process right there. In wine making, in beer making, same thing happens, and you try to trap that CO2, and that produces the carbonated beverage. And that will only go so far, and once enough alcohol is produced, the alcohol, which is a waste product, will then kill off the yeast, and the process stops at a certain percentage of alcohol. So if you were to take that and then put it through a distillation process, you would then separate the alcohol from the liquids, and then you would get a distilled spirit, and that's how you make your other alcohols and all, your and such. Now, in your muscle cells, you'll actually take that pyruvate and turn it into lactate. You take that ending 8 and just scratch that off and put in the 2 letters IC, IC. That would be the name of the acid. So lactic acid, or the lactate ion, same thing. So don't let that bother you right there and such. But you'll produce that. Your liver will then take that and turn it back into something else. So turn it back into glucose, really. But as that lactate accumulates in your muscles, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, in your skeletal muscles, really, it'll change the pH, and then that'll trigger a pain signal, and your muscles will hurt. So, what's the advantage of fermentation? A very quick burst of ATP energy. Very quick. The disadvantage, lactic acid is toxic. So that's why the muscles ache and such. Now your liver will convert that back. And so, but to do that, it actually has to utilize oxygen, which you haven't been able to give to it. And so after this is all done, you will continue to breathe heavily and respire heavily and such to pay your oxygen debt and all. So your liver will take that pyruvate and then convert it back into glucose. That's your recovery of the, and the better in shape you get, the more conditioning you have, the more vasculature, capillaries you build into the muscles, the more oxygen you get to the muscles, which prevents this, and the more rapidly you remove it and all. So how good is fermentation? How good is it? Not as good as oxygen, with oxygen present and such there. So, but we still yield about 2 ATP. And if you look at the numbers on it and such, so you get about 14.6 thousand calories out of this. Glucose holds about 686,000 calories. You do the simple math and you get about 2%. 2% is better than 0. You're still alive. So, but it's much better to have the aerobic respiration and get 38%. That way you're doing a lot better. You have a little surplus when you do it that way. So, but you can't, organisms and such can survive for a little while. Some do thrive quite well with it, but you and I don't. We need the aerobic respiration. So what are the organic molecules of choice? Where do you get your energy from? Of course, glucose is the number one choice, right? That's your blood sugar, your glucose levels and such. You eat a meal, you absorb the glucose, it goes into your blood, it triggers your pancreas to release insulin. Insulin then causes your blood cells to take up or your body cells to take up the glucose. You still have some in the blood. The insulin then, as long as there's glucose in the blood, the insulin is produced and it tells the liver to convert that into glycogen. Your muscles will also convert excess glucose into glycogen. When your glucose levels drop, when they start to fall, then your body registers that and it triggers your pancreas to produce glucagon. And the glucagon then goes to the liver and tells your liver to take that glycogen, which is a stored polysaccharide of glucose, and break it down into glucose. That keeps your blood glucose levels happy, where they're supposed to be. How much glycogen do you store? You got about 12 hours. So if you eat supper at 7 at night and you wake up at 6 in the morning to 7 in the morning, you're done. You have depleted those, so you must eat after that. So don't ever go more than 12 hours without eating. That's bad for you. But most people skip breakfast and they don't perform well because they don't have the glucose. The brains don't fire like they're supposed to, and they're just deficient. So what's the most important meal of the day? Breakfast. Glucose. Breakfast. So another source is fat. We got enough of that, don't we? Look around. But we take excess glucose. When you have a diet that is high in glucose, it clogs up your Krebs cycles. And your bodies will take that pyruvate and that acetyl, and if it can't go into the Krebs cycle, it turns it into fat. Okay, this is a triglyceride, if you will. And it puts it into your adipose tissue. And then that builds up over time. And you have to have a certain amount because this is stored energy and such. But if you look around, we have way too much now because our diets are different than they were 40 or 50 years ago. If your glucose levels were to fall, and if you were not getting glucose from some other source, your body will turn to the fat. And as a process of doing this and such, it'll break that fat down and use it for energy. A lot of energy is there, a lot of energy. But it'll take that triglyceride and chop it up into 2 and 3 carbon fragments and stick it into the Krebs cycle if oxygen is present. Another good source is protein. So you take in a protein, you break it down into the amino acids, then you split off the amine group, which you have to get rid of because that is a poison. And then what's left, the carbon fragment or the carbon skeleton that's left, your body will take that and chop it up into 2 carbon fragments, 3 carbon fragments, 6 carbon fragments, and stick it into the right stage of your respiration. So carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, the best choice for proteins. Then after that, fats in your diet, and then after that, glucose. And if you look at our food pyramids, and if you look at your daily diet, if you'll do that nutritional report, you'll find that our diets are loaded with carbohydrates. And then now you can wonder why we are all obese like we are, because of the excess carbohydrates and such. So, yeah. All right, that's the end of that.